our first question is about one of your article that you wrote in 2014 about the annexion of Crimea of Ukraine in 2014 and what happened in Czechoslovakia. You considered it as unconvincing. Can you tell us why? And did the situation change now with the Russian invasion of Ukraine?
The question really that I'm interested in is, do these comparisons really help? Do we talk about Putin being Hitler or Stalin? How does that help us understand what's going on? And more importantly still, how does it help us in looking at history and using these historical examples, formulate policy? And my problem is when we look back at Czechoslovakia in 1938 on the eve of the Second World War and British, French, German and Italian appeasement, the parallels between them, what's happening today and what was happening back then, are not very clear. And I don't think they're very helpful. And historians need to think very clearly and communicate very clearly to a wider public how we understand the past and how we use the past to look at the present and indeed the future. This is not easy. But what was happening in Czechoslovakia in 1938 was very, very different. And we must remember that at Munich in 1938, it was the decision of the four great powers, Britain, France, Germany, and Italy, to give large parts of Czechoslovakia, the so-called Sudetenlands, to Nazi Germany because of its German-speaking populations. There might seem to be parallels to Russia today, but I don't see how that helps us really understand how to deal with Putin. Yeah. So my concern is thinking very clearly about historical parallels and how they can be used today to inform policy. After all, last night we just had a vote on the UN Security Council. There are questions what EU policy will be, what NATO policy will be, and indeed the individual policies of a variety of wide array of different countries. If we look back to Czechoslovakia, the rise of Nazi Germany, the role of Adolf Hitler in 1938, what does that mean for what we do next today? I don't think that analogy helps any more than the analogy of the Warsaw Pact invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968 really helps us to understand.
The Washington Post published an article with the headlines, Putin's attack on Ukraine echoes Hitler takeover of Czechoslovakia. And I quote one part of it, the argument that Hitler made is very, very similar to the one Putin made to invade Ukraine. So both, let's say, are playing the card of language and nationalism. When Hitler decided to attack Czechoslovakia, his argument was, these people don't want to be part of Czechoslovakia, they are Germans. Putin is saying the same thing today, and he's addressing that the people who speaks Russian, they don't want to be part of Ukraine. They're Russian, and this is the same exact argument. This can be considered as a kind of parallelism, let's say. What can you comment about that?
Trying to choose which historical parallels are useful. Just in the last week, I've heard politicians, commentators, make reference to the Second World War, to the Cold War, to the revolution in Hungary in 1956, to the invasion of Czechoslovakia in 1968, to the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. Now, which one is useful? Which one is helpful? Well, on one level, I think to have a sort of accurate and comprehensive and complex understanding of the past and history is actually sometimes to say that maybe these historical parallels are not useful at all. And that this is a new circumstance, a new situation. And although it might be useful to look back at the past and consider what mistakes were made, the past doesn't repeat itself. And we must be very careful of using past events to inform what's happening now. So as a historian, I would be very, very cautious in making any direct parallels to the past. I mean, one of the problems with, suggesting that Putin is Hitler, suggesting this is like Czechoslovakia again, is a certain amount of historical determinism, that people might be under the impression that well, if Putin's Hitler, then there will be a terrible conflict, as there already is a horrific conflict in Ukraine, as we can see from the television pictures and the suffering of the Ukrainian people. But in the long term, Putin will lose, and like Hitler, you know, the good guys will be victorious. Now, one hopes that's the case, but I don't see how just making that illusion, how making that comparison will lead us to that point. What we need to think about is exactly what policies over the next few days, next few weeks, will actually help bring this situation to an end. The other problem, I think, with using appeasement, Munich, and the beginnings of the Second World War as a comparison is, what does this mean? Does this mean that diplomacy doesn't work? Does this mean that you don't talk to dictators, to autocrats? Does this mean that conflict and war and violence is the only solution? It may well be the case, but to automatically suggest that, to automatically say that there's only hard power and only hard power works, of course, then raises a wide variety of very difficult and troubling questions for the current situation in Europe and the general global security situation.
If we want to go a bit further and see what happened after the invasion of Czechoslovakia, Hitler attacked Poland and World War II started. Do you think the same scenario will happen now?
Of course, in the mind and the twisted ideology of someone like Hitler, and I'm afraid to say also the twisted ideology and base nationalism of what Putin's saying, and this very narrow conception, an inaccurate conception that Putin has of what Ukraine is very dangerous. But that doesn't mean that we have to take it seriously and take it at face value. You know, is this the Cold War again? You know, whatever we think about Putin and Russia, it's quite difficult to call him a communist. In the same way, it's quite difficult to call him a Nazi. I mean, these are phrases that we might throw around and people might think are useful to generate sympathy or an emotional response. We have to be very aware that we don't see the past clearly. We see it through a filter. We see it through a lens. And this is the difficulty of using the past to predict the future. Now, as a historian, I'm very, very cautious of predicting what will happen in the future. I'm watching these events unfold as your viewers are, whether it be on social media, whether it be on the television, whether it be listening to the radio or looking at news websites. One doesn't know how it's going to turn out. This is the unknowability. And of course, if there is any lesson of history to be learned at all, then it's to remember that people in the past didn't know what was going to happen next. We know how the Second World War ended, because we can look back. But the lesson of history is they had no idea what was going to happen next. So why should we? The idea that we can predict what happens next is I'm very cautious about. What we should be aware is we're in the same position that people were in 1939 or 1968 or 1989. Yeah, we don't know what's going to happen next. And my recommendation is to be very cautious of those people who do say they know what's going to happen next. Because after all, many people were shocked and stunned by the events of last Thursday when Russia illegally invaded Ukraine. Many people thought this wouldn't happen. Many people didn't see it coming.
Nancy Pelosi compares Putin's invasion of Ukraine to Hitler's invasion as well of Czechoslovakia. She sees the parallelism not in the way other people are seeing, like the way Germany invaded and the way Putin is invading today Ukraine, but she sees it from the way they both rule as dictators and how they are anti-democracy and anti-freedom of speech. What can you say about this?
Without doubt, Vladimir Putin and his regime in Russia is a dictatorship. It is not a democracy. To then suggest what the historical parallels are to the past, I mean, of course, may we look back at the collapse of democratic norms in the 1930s. After all, Germany, Weimar Germany in the 1920s was a functioning democracy of sorts before Hitler was elected chancellor in 1933. Are there direct parallels there? Well, maybe, but again, very cautious ones. Of course, the appeal of saying Putin is a dictator like Hitler is that it reassures us, that it's a nice, easy comparison that everyone understands. And of course, above all else, everyone understands that Putin is the bad guy, which he is. I don't think there's much debate about that today. However, the threats to democracy, the threats to freedom of speech around the world today do not just come from Russia, do not just come from Eastern Europe or indeed the Far East. Yeah? Those threats to freedom of speech, those threats to democracy can be seen in many countries. So it's very easy to point fingers at others and say they're anti-democratic. Yeah, they're the problem. But also sometimes we need to step back and have a look at where the problems are at home.